In the stifling summer heat of 1847, tragedy struck one of New Orleans' most prominent families. 13 members of the Bogard household perished within hours, collapsing inside their Grand Garden District mansion. The official records buried deep in the Louisiana State Archives attribute their deaths to a sudden fever. Yet, the hurried, almost frantic notes scrawled in the margins whisper of something far more sinister. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, the attending physician, confessed in his private journal that he had never encountered such torment. Their bodies writhed in identical spasms, their fingernails blackened tongues swollen a dark violet, their final cries reverberating through the marble halls until the first light of dawn. What unsettled him most was not just the horror of their deaths, but the precision of it. Each member of the Bogard family died exactly 90 minutes after finishing their traditional Sunday supper. Only one person in that house survived the head cook Violet, who remained in the kitchen as the family gasped their last breaths. For over a century and 70 years, this massacre has been shrouded in silence, wrapped in layers of shame, fear, and deliberate erasure. But tonight, we reopen that locked door. We will uncover what truly unfolded inside that mansion and why an entire bloodline vanished in a single evening. Before we return to Violet's story and the night that history tried to bury, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Stories like this, dark, hidden, and nearly forgotten, are why we continue to search the shadows of America's past. Tap that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. We love hearing where our fellow night travelers are tuning in. The truth of that fatal Sunday supper did not begin at the table. Its roots stretched back years into cycles of cruelty and power that demanded an inevitable reckoning. In 1847, New Orleans was a city of extremes where opulence and suffering existed side by side. The Garden District gleamed with mansions draped in Spanish moss and crowned with wrought iron balconies. But beneath that beauty lay fortunes carved from human bondage. The Bogard mansion itself was a jewel of this district, a towering Greek revival estate with Corinthian columns that seemed to scrape the Louisiana sky. Octave Bogard had inherited both the house and the family's sugar empire, along with a reputation that polite society labeled strict discipline, though those enslaved under him knew it as something much darker. At 43, Octave ruled his plantation and household with an iron fist. His wife, Celeste, a fragile beauty from a prominent Creole lineage, had long since chosen silence over resistance, guarding her position while ignoring her husband's cruelties. Their 4 children, Etienne, 19, Margot, 17, Philippe, 15, and little Amélie, just 8, had been raised to see enslaved people as possessions, no different than the silver candlesticks on their table or the china that bore their meals. The mansion brimmed with extended family as well. Octave's younger brother, Auguste, and his wife, Lucille, lived there with their twin sons, Henri and Louis, both 14. Auguste handled the city-side affairs of the plantation, while Lucille immersed herself in culture, holding glittering salons for New Orleans' elite. Also within those walls lived Octave's formidable mother, Grandmère Bogard, 78 years old and still a commanding presence in family matters, and Celeste's sharp-tongued sister, Tante Félicité, who saw and remembered more than she ever spoke aloud. But beneath this polished household existed 26 enslaved souls carrying invisible scars of bondage. Among them was Violet. Born in the slave quarters in 1823, Violet was the daughter of Essie, the previous head cook who died of exhaustion when Violet was just 14. From that moment, Violet inherited her mother's role and her chains. In the kitchen, Violet displayed a gift so profound it seemed otherworldly. Her hands knew how long to stir a roux until it deepened into perfection, which herbs would transform a simple stew into a masterpiece, and how to balance flavors so flawlessly that guests raved of Bogart suppers across the city. Yet, this mastery came at a cruel price. Violet labored 18 hours a day, rising before dawn and collapsing only after midnight. Her tiny windowless room offering nothing but a straw mattress, a spare dress, and a wooden cross once belonging to her mother. And though she orchestrated banquets that dazzled New Orleans society, she was never permitted to taste them. Every dish had to be judged by sight, by smell, by instinct alone. Octave relished reminding her of this indignity, that while she crafted meals fit for royalty, her own plate would forever be scraps. It was a bitter irony Violet carried with her every day, one that would one day change the fate of the Bogart family forever. Among the enslaved community in the Bogart mansion, Violet carried an unusual burden. The others regarded her with both admiration and sorrow. They admired her unmatched skills in the kitchen, the small privileges her station provided. She was seldom whipped, never forced into the cane fields, and sometimes received cast-off dresses from the ladies of the house. Yet, they also pitied her solitude. The endless hours she labored left little room for the companionship, laughter, and fleeting joys that helped others endure the cruelty of bondage. One pair of eyes, however, often sought her out. Samuel, the son of the stablemaster, was 28, broad-shouldered, steady, and quietly defiant. What began as cautious glances exchanged across the courtyard, then hushed conversations stolen in the kitchen long after midnight, had deepened into something more dangerous affection. Both knew love was a fragile dream under slavery, and yet they held on to it. Samuel whispered of an impossible future of saving enough to buy their freedom, of escaping north to live as man and wife. But on a plantation, where even a single strong field hand could earn his master $50 a year, such freedom seemed as far away as the stars they sometimes gazed upon together. Others in the household carried their own silent stories. Old Moses the butler had been in service for over 4 decades. His bent spine and silvering hair bore witness to a lifetime of bowing under Bogart commands. To outsiders, his loyalty seemed legendary. He appeared with wine before it was requested, vanished at the exact moment privacy was needed, and managed the household with a precision that impressed New Orleans society. Yet, those who looked closely might have glimpsed something sharper behind his calm exterior, a quiet burning fire that no years of servitude had extinguished. Then there was Lily, barely 16, serving as maid to Celeste and her daughters. Her beauty, fragile and unguarded, had not escaped the notice of men within the house, and she lived in quiet dread of what such attention might mean. Lily moved through the mansion, like a shadow, silent, efficient, unseen when she wished to be, though the fear in her eyes betrayed a truth that no grace could conceal. Down in the stables worked Thomas, Samuel's father. His life was etched in weathered lines and steady hands. A master of horses and of survival, Thomas had endured 3 owners, buried 2 wives, and long ago mastered the art of concealing his thoughts behind a mask of calm obedience. He had lived long enough to know that survival often meant silence, even when silence burned like fire in the chest. The Bogard household itself revolved around an unyielding rhythm, a schedule set, like clockwork and maintained across generations. Breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, served in the sunlit room overlooking the gardens. Luncheon at 1 in the afternoon, often with visitors from New Orleans' elite, discussing business, society, or politics. Yet it was Sunday supper that stood above all else, the crown of the week. Every Sunday evening at 6, the extended Bogard family assembled beneath the glittering crystal chandelier in the grand dining hall, a chandelier shipped at immense cost from Paris itself. The great table capable of seating 20 gleamed with sterling silver-polished china and crystal goblets that caught and fractured the candlelight like fragments of stars. These suppers were not mere meals, they were rituals. For the Bogards, they were sacred moments when commerce was put aside, when the family affirmed its unity and power, in a performance as carefully choreographed as a liturgy. For Violet's Sunday supper was both triumph and torment. Beginning on Friday, she would comb the French market for the finest produce, herbs and spices, crafting menus that balanced tradition with spectacle. The meal would unfold in 7 courses, a delicate soup fish with carefully wrought sauces, poultry perfumed with exotic seasonings, an array of vegetables fresh from the garden, sumptuous roasts and meat, courses meant to display wealth and skill, and finally desserts as ornate and breathtaking as any artist's canvas. The ritual never varied. At 5:30, the family gathered in the parlor for cocktails. The men sipped brandy imported across the Atlantic, while the women savored delicate cordials. Conversations drifted between plantation business politics and the endless tide of local gossip, while children were expected to listen in silence, absorbing the hierarchy of their bloodline. At the stroke of 6, Moses would appear, his voice smooth and solemn. Supper is served. The family would then process into the dining room with the gravity of a religious rite. Octave claimed the head of the table. Celeste sat at the opposite end, and each member took their seat, according to a strict order never altered through the years. At Octave's right hand, Grand-Mère Bogard maintained her honored place, her presence still formidable despite her age. At his left sat Auguste, the younger brother who helped manage the family fortune. It was within this polished ritual chandelier, blazing silver gleaming servants waiting silently, that the seeds of destruction were set. And it was Violet, unseen in the shadows of the kitchen, who bore the weight of it all. Conversation at the Bogard supper table was always a performance, a theater of refinement. Each family member knew their part in maintaining the illusion of harmony of wealth untouched by worry. Yet, beneath this veneer, tension seethed like a pot, just short of boiling. The spring of 1847 had brought unusual strain. The sugar harvest of the previous year had been devastated by floods, and creditors were beginning to press with unwelcome persistence. Octave, once so proud of his untouchable prosperity, had already sold parcels of land and quietly considered the most unthinkable recourse selling off human lives to pay his debts. The thought left him raw, volatile, and crueler than ever. His temper, never mild, now ignited without warning. Those enslaved in the household became expert readers of his moods, watching the twitch of his jaw as he studied ledgers. The sharp edge to his orders, and most dangerous of all, the way. His eyes hardened with a calculating coldness whenever he was devising some new cruelty. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Violet and Samuel's bond deepened into something too real to ignore. And it was during those suffocating weeks of June that the moment came which set every later tragedy into motion. On a sweltering Thursday afternoon, the Louisiana heat pressed down like a weight upon New Orleans. In the kitchen, Violet worked with quiet precision, arranging delicate canapes for a dinner party in honor of visiting plantation owners from Charleston. The air was heavy with the scent of roasting meats and simmering sauces when a sudden shout cut through the stillness. A voice she knew too well. Samuel. She hurried to the kitchen window, heart pounding. In the courtyard, Samuel knelt in the dust, his shirt torn and smeared with blood. Towering over him stood Octave, whip in hand, face contorted with fury, spittle flying from his lips. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes," Octave's roar carried across the courtyard. "You forget your place, boy." Violet's blood ran cold. She knew instantly what had happened. Margot, 17 and restless, had been spending more time near the stables. Violet had noticed the blush that crept into the girl's cheeks whenever Samuel passed, and Samuel's careful efforts to avoid her gaze, to keep his distance. But on a plantation, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was never seen as innocence. It was twisted into defiance, into presumption, into crime. And crimes such as that were often punished by death. "Please, Master Bogard." Samuel gasped between blows, his back striped with raw lashes. I would never. Silence. The whip cracked again, splitting the humid air and Samuel's skin alike. "Your silence is guilt enough." As Octave raised his arm for another strike, Violet's body moved before her mind could catch up. She burst through the kitchen door, flinging herself between Samuel's bleeding back and the descending whip. "Please, Master Octave," she cried, her voice shaking but resolute. "Samuel's done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard." Her words faltered as Octave's eyes fell upon her. His expression shifted from open rage to something colder, sharper, far more dangerous. Around them, the other enslaved servants drew back into the shadows, unwilling to be seen, knowing instinctively that something irreversible was about to unfold. So, Octave murmured, his voice dropping low, more terrifying than his shouting had been. "The cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." Violet's knees quivered, but she did not move from her place, shielding Samuel. "No, Master. You just..." What Octave stepped closer until his breath reeked of brandy in her face. The red veins in his eyes stood out like cracks in glass. "You think, because you can cook a fine supper, you have the right to question my judgment? You think you can forget who you are?" The courtyard fell silent, save for Samuel's ragged breathing and the lonely call of a mockingbird somewhere in the garden. Violet's heart pounded, but when she looked down at Samuel, broken and bleeding in the dirt, a strange clarity overcame her. "Samuel is a good man," she said again, her voice steady now. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Octave's laugh was jagged like glass shattering on stone. "A good man." His voice dripped with scorn. "He's property, girl. My property, and so are you." He leaned in closer, his whisper carrying venom. "I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? Gotten ideas above your station?" What came next was punishment not only of flesh, but of spirit. Samuel was dragged to the stables and locked in the tack room, denied food, denied water, condemned to suffer until Octave decided he had learned respect. But for Violet, Octave devised something crueler still. From that day forward, he declared she would continue to prepare every meal for the household, but she would not take a single bite until every member of the family had pronounced themselves satisfied. And since he added with a thin smile, "I am not easily satisfied," the threat hung in the air like funeral smoke, heavy, choking, and inescapable. The following 3 days were a torment beyond description. Violet continued to prepare elaborate meals for the Bogard family, though her own body was fueled by little more than water and the scraps that old Moses or Lily dared sneak to her when no eyes were watching. Her hands trembled as she kneaded dough. Her vision blurred while she stirred sauces. Her legs wavered beneath the weight of silver platters she carried to the dining table. Yet her hunger was not the cruelest part. Octave turned her meals into a theater of humiliation. Each dish was declared wanting. The soup too salty. The meat too tough. The vegetables ruined by overcooking. Every criticism meant another day without sustenance. He savored the ritual, pausing to describe in florid detail the flavors of each morsel, while Violet stood silent in the corner, forced to watch him relish the food she had crafted, but was forbidden to taste. On the second day, Samuel escaped the tack room, driven less by his own suffering than by fear for Violet's. He made it as far as the kitchen before Octave's men descended upon him. The beating that followed was so brutal that Dr. Thibodeau had to be summoned to ensure Samuel survived it. While tending to the man's wounds, Thibodeau noticed Violet hovering close. Her face was gaunt from hunger, but her eyes burned with a strange, unsettling intensity. Later that night, he confessed unease to his wife. "That girl," he said quietly, "has the look of someone pushed past breaking. I've seen it before. It's dangerous." Thibodeau knew cruelty intimately, both as physician to the wealthy and secret caretaker of the enslaved. Most souls, when pressed too far, simply collapsed, becoming hollow, dulled, lifeless. But some few, he had observed, transformed instead. Their pain hardened into resolve. They bided their time, planning with cold precision, waiting for the perfect strike. As he looked at Violet's steady hands, dressing Samuel's wounds when they should have quivered with exhaustion, he recognized that look. He told himself he would warn Octave. But like so many well-meant intentions, the warning remained unspoken until it was too late. On the third day, something in Violet shifted irrevocably. As she swayed on her feet in the dining room, watching Octave theatrically savor a slice of her praline bread, pudding clarity settled over her like a cold fog. Her mind, sharpened by suffering, began to observe details she had never noticed. Octave's hands trembled when he was anxious, sign that his financial ruin was nearer than he admitted. Celeste's gaze darted again and again toward the brandy decanter, a quiet betrayal of her growing dependence. Young Philippe's lingering glances at Lily carried a darkness that churned Violet's stomach. More importantly, Violet began to study the family as she once studied recipes. Grom Bogard always took her medicine half an hour before meals. August checked his pocket watch like clockwork every 15 minutes at dinner. Little Amelie ate vegetables first, always saving her favorite bite for last. These once ordinary observations now became pieces of a puzzle. For the first time, Violet no longer saw masters at her table. She saw weaknesses, patterns, solutions. That night, collapsing onto her straw mattress, after Octave finally declared himself marginally satisfied, Violet made her choice. She would continue to serve the Bogards with the same care and artistry she had always shown, but soon she would serve them something they would never forget. Her plan was not born of rage nor sudden impulse. It was conceived with the meticulous patience she applied to her finest meals. Every detail measured, every step deliberate. She would wait until the moment was perfect, and then the Bogards would dine on a feast that echoed for eternity. By July, New Orleans lay under a furnace, sky the air thick enough to choke. Outwardly, Violet seemed restored to her old rhythms. She moved with silent efficiency, her face a mask of subservience. To the casual eye, Octave's punishment had worked, his cook broken, her rebellion smothered. But those who knew her best saw otherwise. Old Moses, who had survived decades by reading people as one reads the weather, noted a difference in her movements. Where once she worked with the fluid grace of someone who loved her craft, she now moved with clockwork, precision, mechanical, and relentless. Her famous intuition in the kitchen, the uncanny ability to know a loaf was ready by its scent, or to taste a sauce with only her eyes, had sharpened into something uncanny, almost supernatural. Samuel, recovering from his beating, watched her with a growing fear. The woman he loved had once been warmth embodied with a laugh that could scatter shadows. But that laugh was gone. In its place, he saw something colder, sharper, like the edge of a blade honed in secret. The woman who now crept to Samuel's side in the hushed hours before dawn seemed carved from something other than flesh and bone. Her touch was still gentle as she cleaned his wounds, but her eyes carried a reptilian coldness, the same chilling gaze snakes fix upon prey moments before they strike. Violet, Samuel whispered one morning as she gathered her things to return to the kitchen. "You're scaring me, girl. What's going on in that head of yours?" She paused at the door, her silhouette haloed in the thin grey light that filtered through the quarter's single window. When she turned back, the look on her face drained the warmth from his blood. "I'm going to take care of everything," she murmured. "You don't need to worry anymore." "What do you mean, take care of everything?" But she was gone before he could stop her, leaving Samuel with a suffocating certainty. The woman he loved was planning something that would consume them all. The Bogards, however, remained blind to these changes. If anything, they congratulated themselves on Octave's discipline. To their eyes, Violet was renewed. Her meals, already legendary, seemed now to surpass themselves, her flavors more exquisite, her presentations ever more elaborate, her attention to detail bordering on obsession. What they could not see was that Violet had begun an entirely different sort of research. On her daily errands to the French market, she took detours that had nothing to do with food. She slipped into the shaded stalls where herb sellers and medicine women plied their trade on the margins of New Orleans' respectable commerce. There, beneath the clamor of vendors and the scent of spices, she asked questions cloaked in innocence. Questions about plants and their hidden properties. In 1847, New Orleans was a city where medicine and magic entwined like roots beneath the earth. African traditions, Caribbean voodoo, and native knowledge blended into an underground current of healing and of harm. Here remedies could soothe or kill. A powder that cured fever in one hand could summon death in another. Violet listened carefully, never prying too directly. A casual remark about a root that calmed the stomach. A passing comment about a mushroom that mimicked fever. Each word she absorbed, storing it in silence. Most of all, she sought knowledge of combination subtle pairings that might baffle even a trained physician. Her most trusted source emerged in the form of Mama Brigitte, a Creole woman, whose stall stood deep in the market's shadows. Some swore she was over 90 born free in Haiti before the revolution, her age and wisdom as tangled and unknowable as the herbs she sold. To those who sought her out, Mama Brigitte was a legend. She asked Violet no questions, demanded no reasons. Perhaps she sensed the desperation beneath Violet's calm. Perhaps she understood that knowledge is power and power belongs to those who need it most. So she began to share secrets that no apothecary would speak aloud to a slave. This root here, she rasped, holding up a twist of bark, good for stomach pains in small dose. Too much though, it turned quick. Make a person sick fast, very fast. Violet drank in her words like parched earth drinks rain. She learned of herbs that could stifle the breath roots that disrupted the rhythm of the heart mushrooms, that summoned visions or sudden collapse mistaken for apoplexy. More precious still, she learned about time, about dose, about how a body absorbs and betrays poison, how weight and constitution decide whether a taste brings discomfort or death. Cooking. Once Violet's art of sustenance became something else entirely, a science of control. And as the summer dragged on, she began to test her new knowledge. Just the smallest pinch of powder in a sauce, enough for August to complain of mild indigestion. A whisper of an herb in a stew, just enough for young Felipe to turn pale with nausea. The Bogards noticed nothing. They saw only perfection on their plates. Violet saw something else proof that her hands now held the power to heal or to ruin. These careful experiments became Violet's private scripture. Each pinch, each whisper of herb revealed truths about tolerances, sensitivities, and weaknesses knowledge. She catalogued with the precision of a surgeon. The Bogards never suspected. When Celeste clutched her stomach and complained of faint nausea, it was dismissed as nothing more than Louisiana's heavy summer air. Dr. Thibodeau prescribed a tonic and cautioned against rich foods. When little Emily grew listless after supper, Octave merely waved it away as the natural languor of a child in the oppressive heat. But Violet knew better. She was charting the vulnerabilities of every member of the household one by one. Her new focus carried a cost. She had always lived at the margins of the slave community, in the house respected but apart bound to her endless duties in the kitchen. Now even those fragile ties frayed. Lily, once quick to confide her fears, found Violet's answers cool, perfunctory, as though spoken from behind a locked door. Old Moses, who had been like a father since Violet's childhood, sensed her distance too. Their talks, once filled with warmth, shrank into brief exchanges. Even Thomas Samuel's father began to regard her warily, as one regards a chained dog that no longer wags its tail, quiet, watchful, but with something dangerous coiled beneath the surface. Only Samuel still glimpsed the truth, though she kept him at arm's length. In rare moments alone, he pleaded with her, "You're changing. "Violet," he whispered one August night as they sat in the garden behind the quarters, their words hushed against the thick humidity. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize." Violet lifted her eyes toward the stars blurred by the haze. For a heartbeat, her mask slipped. Samuel saw the sorrow and fury she had carried alone, burning her from the inside. "They took everything from me," she murmured. "My mama, my childhood, my freedom. And when I found something worth holding on to, when I found you, they took that too. They beat you like a beast, and they made me watch. They starved me, laughed at me, made my pain their entertainment." He reached for her hand. She pulled away. "That don't mean you got to become like them," Samuel pleaded. "I'm not becoming like them," Violet said. And the calm finality in her voice chilled him deeper than rage ever could. "They destroy because they love it. I'll destroy because I must. What are you planning, Violet? What are you going to do?" She turned to him then, and what he saw in her eyes hollowed him with dread, not fury, not despair, but a terrible serenity. "I'm going to serve them exactly what they deserve," she whispered. "Nothing more, nothing less." As summer waned and the air shifted toward the gentler warmth of early autumn, Violet's preparations reached their final cadence. She had her ingredients, her knowledge of dose and timing, and a meticulous understanding of the Bogart's habits. All that remained was to wait for the perfect occasion, an evening when indulgence would mask her true design. That opportunity came in late September. Octave, flushed with triumph after a rare season of prosperity, announced a grand Sunday supper. The sugar harvest had saved him from ruin, restored his place among New Orleans' proud planters, and filled the mansion with a feverish bustle of preparations. "This will be a feast to remember," he declared, his voice booming with pride. And Violet, standing silently at the edge of the room, already knew it would indeed be remembered, but not for the reasons Octave imagined. The guest list glittered like the very crown of Louisiana society. Judge Honoré Dufresne and his wife, the wealthy banker, Edouard Blanchot, the merchant magnate Ali Boudreau, all had accepted Octave's summons. The Reverend Father Antoine Marini would bless the table, while Dr. Armand Thibideau, both physician and lifelong friend, would attend in dual capacity. Even Mayor Augustus Chouteau had agreed to grace the gathering. In all, 23 distinguished guests would join 13 members of the Bogart family for an evening meant to celebrate prosperity, power, and survival. For Violet, it was the perfect stage. A grand supper where every tormentor, every accomplice, and every witness to her humiliation would be gathered under one roof, their defenses lowered by food, drink, and spectacle. The scale of the feast demanded flawless execution, and Violet delivered with an intensity that startled even the Bogarts. Octave, in his pride, ensured that every house slave would remain on duty that evening, circulating through the rooms to tend to the guests. To him, it was a matter of grandeur and control. To Violet, it was providence. No one would escape, no one absent when the reckoning came. In the days before the supper, she prowled the French market with almost religious devotion. Each tomato inspected for ripeness, each cut of meat tested for its marbling, each herb chosen not merely for flavor but for potency. Her menu was a symphony of Creole tradition and innovation, part culinary triumph, part hidden scripture of revenge. The courses unfolded like movements in a grand requiem. First, a turtle soup, its seasonings calculated to awaken the appetite and sharpen anticipation. Then, pompano bathed in an intricate sauce that demanded hours of precise attention. A third course of squab stuffed with rice and vegetables from her family's lineage, altered now in ways her ancestors could never have condoned. Beef and pork followed, roasted and braised to perfection, flanked by garden vegetables and bread risen with exacting patience. And for the finale, her famous Proline bread pudding with custard sauce, the jewel of New Orleans supper tables, a recipe whispered through generations of enslaved women, perfected by Violet until no society gathering dared end without it. The guests would smile, sigh, and savor, never knowing this version carried a secret inheritance more potent than any tradition. On Friday morning, she made her final pilgrimage to Mama Brigitte's stall. The ancient woman's eyes, usually sharp with mischief, carried a heaviness this time. "You sure about this path you're walking, child?" she asked as she wrapped the last bundle of herbs in brown paper. "Once you start down this road, there ain't no turning back." Violet met her gaze, her voice steady, stripped of hesitation. "I've already gone too far to turn back." They made sure of that. The old woman pressed the bundle into her hand, her whisper barely audible over the market's bustle. "Then may God have mercy on all your souls, 'cause you won't find it anywhere else." That weekend, the kitchen became a sanctum of ritual. Violet moved like a clockmaker at work on a masterpiece, every motion exact, every gesture deliberate. The cheerful hum that had once accompanied her cooking was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it unsettled the staff who drifted in and out. Samuel, hobbling now but strong enough to wander the grounds, found excuses to linger by the kitchen door. What he saw chilled him. Violet at her table hands, deft and unerring, her face carved in stone. There was no joy left in her craft, only precision, only purpose. By Saturday night, as the final components of the feast fell into place, Samuel could bear it no longer. He stepped forward, heart pounding, and confronted her directly. He waited until the kitchen was empty, the clatter of pans and footsteps fading, leaving only the low hiss of the hearth. Violet stood at the work table, her hands moving with surgical precision as she polished her knives, the steel glinting in the lamplight. Samuel approached slowly, his voice breaking into the silence like a prayer too fragile to be spoken aloud. "Violet, I'm begging you, whatever you're planning, don't do it. There has to be another way." Her hands froze on the blade, though she didn't lift her gaze. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint scrape of cloth against steel. Then, without looking up, she whispered almost to herself, "Another way to what? Samuel, to freedom, to justice." At last, she raised her eyes. The look in them made Samuel stumble back a step. Her voice was flat, steady, merciless. "You think there's justice for people like us? You think if we wait long enough, pray hard enough, work hard enough, someone will come along and set it right?" His throat tightened. "I think if you do this, you'll destroy yourself right along with them." Violet set the knife carefully on the table and turned to face him fully. "I've already been destroyed. What's left is deciding whether I die alone or take them with me." Samuel's voice cracked. "And what about me? What about us?" For the briefest instant, her mask slipped. A flicker of warmth of the woman he loved flashed across her face, but vanished almost before it appeared. Her words came soft but final. If you truly love me, you'll find a way not to be here tomorrow night. Samuel's chest tightened as the weight of her meaning sank in. His lips parted, trembling. Dear God, Violet, what have you done? But she had already turned back to her work cloth, sliding over steel once more. He knew then that whatever chance there had been to stop her had died weeks ago in that courtyard under a punishing sun, when the whip fell across his back and something deep inside Violet had broken forever. Sunday, October 3rd, 1847. The day dawned clear and cool, the first breath of autumn stirring relief across New Orleans after another suffocating summer. At the Bogard mansion, the household woke before sunrise, buzzing with anticipation of what was certain to be the social event of the season. Violet rose with them as she had for a decade of dawns, but this morning was no routine. Donning the crisp white apron and head wrap of her station, she caught sight of herself in the jagged shard of mirror that hung above her wash basin. The face staring back seemed that of a stranger, cheeks hollowed from weeks of punishment, eyes carrying a serenity more terrible than rage. She studied her reflection as though committing it to memory, then turned away. The woman she had been was gone. The kitchen erupted into orchestrated chaos, but unlike past banquets, Violet allowed no one near the most critical tasks: sauces, seasonings. The delicate balances that only she understood, these she guarded like sacred rites. Old Moses, ever watchful as Butler noticed her uncanny awareness of the house that morning. She paused when footsteps crossed the hall, tilted her head toward conversations carried faintly from other rooms, as though she tracked the entire mansion by ear. "Girl got ears like a cat today," he muttered to Lily as they polished silver. "Actin' stranger than I've ever seen." Lily only nodded, her own nerves stretched taut. Violet had been different ever since that punishment, withdrawn, unreachable. What neither of them realized was that Violet's vigilance was no madness. Every sound, every movement, every presence was another gear in the invisible clockwork of her design. Timing was everything. By mid-morning, the Bogard mansion shimmered in readiness. Fresh flowers brightened each room. Crystal sparkled with refracted light. The great dining table gleamed under rows of polished silver arranged with such precision it seemed like mathematics, rendered in glass and gold. And in the kitchen, Violet moved alone, silent and sure, preparing the feast that would be remembered for generations, not for its flavor but for its fate. The Bogard family's finest china, imported from Limoges at tremendous expense, gleamed beneath the chandelier's golden light, set against Irish linen as pale as fresh snow. Sterling silver caught the glow and scattered it like a field of stars, while the long dining table stood ready as a stage for what promised to be the grandest performance of Violet's life. Around noon, the family began their own rituals of preparation. Celeste spent hours with Lily, arranging her hair into an elaborate crown of curls, pinned so tightly it strained her temples. Gran Bora, though frail with age, demanded her black silk dress and the emeralds that had passed through 3 generations of Bogards. In Octave's study, the men sampled brandy and congratulated themselves on a harvest well met their talk, drifting easily between sugar profits and rumors from Washington. August, flushed with drink and pride, boasted loudly of his shrewd dealings, while young Phipe and the twins, Ori and Louis, strutted in new suits, and little Emily spun about in her white organdy dress like a cherub carved from porcelain. The children, of course, had been sternly warned, seen, admired, but silent. By late afternoon, carriages began to arrive. Judge Dufresne and his wife Matilda were the first through the great doors, followed by banker Blanchot, with his glittering daughter Celestine, already the object of countless suitors. Dr. Tibido appeared medical bag in hand, more from habit than hope of necessity, while the arrival of Mayor Augustus Shuto sent murmurs of awe through the household. The mayor, broad-bellied and resplendent with whiskers, wasted no time in delivering florid compliments to Octave and grand predictions for Louisiana's sugar empire. It was during these arrivals, amid the bustle, greetings, and champagne laughter, that Violet performed the most critical act of her plan. In the shelter of her kitchen, she measured powders and tinctures with the focus of a surgeon at his table. Each portion was subtle, tailored to the eater. A whisper of bitterness, masked by sauce, a trace of powder stirred into wine, an infusion hidden beneath the fragrance of herbs. No dish alone held enough to draw suspicion, but together they formed a symphony of inevitability. She understood the body as well as she understood food, and her timing would be flawless. Symptoms would bloom like flowers, one by one, then all at once. At precisely 6 o'clock, old Moses stepped into the parlor doorway, bowing low. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, "supper is served." The company moved in procession, following the rigid hierarchy that had long governed Bogard meals. Octave, arm in arm with the mayor, led the way. Celeste followed on Judge Dufresne's arm, while Grande Bora claimed her honored seat with Etienne's steadying hand at her elbow. The dining room unfolded before them in full splendor. Dozens of candles blazed, crystal goblets glowed like prisms, and the air shimmered with the aroma of Violet's craft, rich enough to make mouths water before the first spoon was lifted. Octave, beaming like a king, surveying his court, assured the guests they were about to taste the finest meal New Orleans had ever known. Even Dr. Tibido, worldly and skeptical, found himself eager with anticipation. In the kitchen's shadows, Violet remained unseen, her apron spotless, her eyes sharp and still. She did not beam with pride as she once had at past banquets. Tonight she watched the servers carry each dish to the table, with the dispassion of a scientist observing her experiment unfold, the hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal marking the slow, deliberate march toward revelation. The feast began with a parade of delicacies that seemed almost too grand for a single household. Silver domes were lifted to reveal steaming bowls of turtle soup, each one perfumed with nutmeg and sherry. The guests leaned into their bowls with delight, praising the rich flavor and the Bogards' impeccable hospitality. Platters of oysters followed, arranged on beds of shaved ice that glittered like jewels under the chandelier. Roasted quail appeared next, its skin lacquered and crisp, paired with a dark Madeira sauce that clung like velvet to the tongue. The house filled with the rising hum of laughter, of compliments and toasts. At first, no one noticed. A gentleman at the far end of the table set down his fork and dabbed his brow with a linen napkin. Another excused herself, quietly swaying slightly as she rose. By the third course, the murmurs began an uneasy ripple beneath the polite chatter. Some pressed their hands to their stomachs. Others grew pale, their voices faltering mid-sentence. The oysters, so fresh and glistening minutes before now, seemed like cruel instruments. Then it swept through the room like a contagion of agony. A child vomited onto the velvet carpet. A woman collapsed, her glass of wine shattering beside her as her body convulsed. Men clutched at their throats, their breaths ragged and shallow. Chairs toppled, silver cutlery scattered across the table. Crystal glasses rang as they fell. The air filled with the choking stench of sickness, the cries of pain, and the sharp terror of those who realized they were next. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, who had been summoned for formality more than necessity, suddenly found himself at the center of a nightmare. He moved from guest to guest, eyes darting, noting symptoms: constriction of the pupils, violent retching, the strange rigidity of muscles. "This is no fever," he whispered hoarsely, though no one seemed able to listen. His journal would later record that he had never seen death move so uniformly, as though the entire house had swallowed a single lethal command. Through it all, Violet Bogard remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face betrayed nothing, though in her eyes flickered something unreadable: grief, perhaps, or triumph. Only her brother Samuel, crouched beside her in horror, noticed the way her gaze swept over the writhing bodies with a strange, chilling calm. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw in her the tenderness of the sister he had once adored. But as the screams rose and the chandeliers trembled with the chaos, he realized it was only the reflection of the fire she herself had lit, one that would consume them all. The woman he had once known was gone forever. In her place stood someone reshaped by sorrow into an instrument of justice, terrible, unyielding, and as final as the grave itself. "I served them exactly what they deserved." Violet whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the dying moans from the dining room. Nothing more, nothing less. By midnight, silence blanketed the Bogard mansion. Only the faint prayers of the surviving enslaved echoed in the halls, mingling with the steady scratch of Dr. Thibodeau's pen as he forced his trembling hand to record the death certificates required by law. That he lived through the ordeal at all was something he never fully understood. Perhaps his small portions born of modest appetite had spared him, or perhaps years of dosing himself with medicines had given him an unnatural resistance. Whatever the reason, the mystery would torment him all his days. The official record preserved even now in the Louisiana State Archives attributed the deaths to a sudden fever of unknown origin. Thibodeau knew this was a lie, but also a necessity. To admit the truth that the most prominent family in New Orleans society had been poisoned in their own dining room would plunge the city into panic and stain its reputation beyond repair. And in truth, Violet's methods were too precise, too cunning. Every substance she had chosen existed in nature, each one harmless in isolation, but together they formed a symphony of death. No autopsy in 1847 could untangle. What followed became known only in whispers as the Bogard tragedy. The plantation, stripped of its masters, was seized by creditors and sold at auction. The mansion stood hollow for nearly a decade before passing into new hands. The enslaved people were scattered across Louisiana, their families torn apart by the cold arithmetic of liquidation. Some, like old Moses, found buyers who valued their experience. Others, like Lily, still young and strong, were swallowed into the dark trade that fed the sugar fields of the Deep South. Samuel lingered a little longer, sold to a Mississippi cotton plantation where he died 2 years later in an accident that some believed was no accident at all. He never recovered from that October night. Those who knew him said death came to him as a welcome guest. Violet herself vanished from the record. Some claimed she was sold in secret to a distant parish where she died in obscurity. Others swore she slipped away into freedom, making her way north. Yet, the most enduring tale still whispered in the French Quarter insists she walked out of the mansion that night and never looked back, reinventing herself under another name, feeding the poor of New Orleans with the same skill that had once condemned the Bogards. Dr. Thibodeau carried the secret for the rest of his life. When his private journals were discovered a century later, they revealed both his horror and his reluctant admiration. She was not a killer by nature, he wrote. She was driven there by suffering a suffering that would have broken most souls long before hers. In one haunting line, he confessed, "If guilt must be assigned, it belongs not only to her, but to all of us who lived within and tolerated the system that left her no other path." And so the Bogard mansion became more than a ruin. Rebuilt, abandoned, occupied, demolished, it was said the kitchen always remained curiously intact, as though guarded by unseen hands. Guests spoke of sudden illness during dinner, of strange scents of caramel and spice lingering in empty rooms, of a young woman's shadow standing by the stove in the blue hours before dawn. By the late 19th century, locals spoke of it as one of New Orleans' most haunted houses, a place where history itself seemed unwilling to rest. Yet perhaps the truest haunting was not of ghosts at all. Violet's story reminds us that slavery was not only cruel, it was unsustainable. Every system of oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Bogards died not because Violet was evil, but because the world they built gave her no other path to dignity, no other instrument of justice. 13 people perished in that dining room. None of them were monsters in the simplest sense. They were products of their time, raised to see human bondage as natural. But their comfort was purchased with the suffering of others. And in the end, that suffering returned to claim its debt. Violet's vengeance was both inevitable and tragic. Inevitable because she was driven beyond endurance. Tragic because a woman who once created joy through food was forced to turn her art into a weapon. She was not born to kill. She was made into one. And so perhaps the true spectre that lingers over the Bogard mansion is not Violet herself, but the guilt of a society built on human bondage. That is the ghost that refuses to rest. What do you think of this tale? Was it true justice or a crime too far? Could Violet really have planned such a perfect revenge? Or has history embellished her story to fit its own hunger for legend? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy these dark chapters of history, remember to subscribe. Hit the bell and join me again as we uncover more tales where the line between tragedy and horror grows very thin.